So delighted that for Pride Shabbat this year, our speaker is our very own Rena Yehuda Newman, who can't be with us in person because they live in Brooklyn and doing amazing work in Brooklyn. Rena is the editor of New Voices magazine, which is a Jewish magazine for young people in college and slightly beyond to express their opinions about the world and how Judaism should be lived in our current era. Rena, for those of us who knew and loved her, many of you sitting right here in the sanctuary, including their father, Dave Newman, who's right here, knew and know Rena as someone who's always been brilliant, insightful, articulate, forward-thinking, and challenging in the best possible way. And so we're delighted to be able to hear from them today. When Rena sent me the video, of course this was made several days earlier and didn't know that today would be the day that we would have the Supreme Court ruling. But in typical brilliant Rena fashion, they wrote me this note when they sent me the video. I send this with a heavy heart in light of the Roe decision, but this speech isn't entirely disconnected from those issues of autonomy and gender issues. And so we're celebrating Pride, we're celebrating the gains we have made, and also mourning the loss of some of the gains that we have made. And we'll learn from Rena and continue to work together. But when we see the brilliance of young people like Rena Yehuda Newman, who is leading many other young people, and not only writes, but she's also a cartoonist and draws beautifully, we know we are in good hands. Thank God for Rena Yehuda Newman. I'm so delighted to hear from them tonight.
Hello and Shabbat Shalom from New York City. My name is Rena Yehuda Newman. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm very honored to get to give this Devar Torah as someone who grew up at Beth Emet. I'm so glad to join you via video here tonight to speak about what it means to protect our queer youth in Jewish spaces this Pride Month, and always. But let's start with the Torah portion. Parshat Shlach tells us the story of the scouts going into Eretz Yisrael, the Promised Land, for the very first time. But when they return, there are two very different reports. The larger set of scouts returns terrified, quaking in their boots. There are giants there, they say. They'll crush us like grasshoppers. We can't go in. But the second, much smaller contingent brings back huge grapes and foodstuffs. This is a land of milk and honey, they say. We can and should enter the land that was promised to us. There is something better waiting at the other side. These moments of collective choice, bolstered by fear and hope, are familiar to all of us who have been a part of a movement or a community working towards change. This Pride Month, in the boilerplate of the United States, we are living inside of a critical moment of choice around how we talk about gender and sexuality with stakes that are higher than ever. As anti-transgender legislation floods the legislatures of the country, including bills that would have direct and dire consequences specifically for queer and transgender youth, with an increasingly militarized and fascistic right-wing movement growing in momentum with gender nonconformity in its direct crosshairs, the struggle towards liberation and actual safety can feel hopeless. But it's my belief that all change must start within the realm of what we can control, the personal, local, and immediate. We have decisions to make within our own Jewish communities about how we are protecting LGBTQ youth. In my work as editor of New Voices magazine, a national progressive publication by and for Jewish students and writers ages 18 to 24, this year has been one of major publishing around issues of a particularly taboo topic, youth sexuality. This past month, we came out with a major investigation entitled How Jewish Summer Camps Are Damaging LGBTQ Youth, a topic that, as you can imagine, is quite heavy on my heart as a transgender Jew and an Asuri summer camp alum. The months spent collecting interviews and editing drafts was emotional to say the least, but what struck me most from working with journalist Julia Hegeli to bring this story to fruition was all of the factors that resulted in so much trauma for young queer Jews, even long before they identified as LGBTQ. These factors are actually pretty non-obvious, especially for anybody who either hasn't attended camp or isn't under the rainbow flag. In a nutshell, the most major contributing factors to experiences of alienation, discomfort, exclusion, and even abuse within Jewish summer camp environments were subtle but pervasive cultural forces. Here's the outline. 1. A hypersexualized, extremely heteronormative camp culture which put a constant pressure to participate in romantic or sexual activity, specifically with the so-called opposite gender, despite having ambiguous or no clear guidelines around consent or acceptable camp sexual behavior. 2. Binarily gendered environments without non-gendered options, including cabins, tents, activities, units, chants and cheers, Shabbat dress codes, and more. 3. Camp's brand of over-the-top enthusiasm for everything, including gendered activities, leading to queer kids feeling like their coming out would ruin everybody else's fun. To quote the article, many LGBTQ former campers expressed that a primary feeling of their queer beginnings at camp was guilt. 4. Staff members who either exacerbated camp heteronormativity by encouraging their campers to participate romantically or sexually with each other, or staff members who weren't properly trained in how to support campers struggling with their gender, sexuality, or in dealing with the aftermath of harassment and assault. 5. An absence of policy and resources regarding consent and camper sexual behavior, which leads to a culture of silence around actual sexual or romantic behavior between campers, including and especially when those encounters weren't exactly consensual, leading to feelings of shame, confusion, guilt, and even trauma. Combined with the erasure and silence around same-gender attraction, assuming that sexual harassment and assault can only happen between boys and girls, many queer campers didn't realize that many of the things that had happened to them at camp weren't okay, often until years after they'd come out, usually as adults. The result of all of these factors combined were devastating for many of the former campers interviewed. It's even more painful to hold all of this pain because we know that Jewish spaces should be places where all of us feel the most safe in our bodies, where youth learn to respect themselves and each other and see this as part of the sacred brit, the sacred covenant that we have towards one another as Jews and as fellow human beings. But we can't get there by keeping silent about it. As an alum of Beth Emet's 7th grade Gesher program, I feel that I was actually uniquely well prepared to discuss these topics as I got older. My 7th grade year, the bulk of our annual Beit Sefer time was dedicated to a curriculum called Sacred Choices, Gender and Sexuality Education Tailored to a Jewish Spiritual Context. At times, I remember the curriculum felt a little scandalous. Led by trained educators, we made a huge list of all of the slang terms for genitalia that we could think of, got to write down questions about sex and bodies on little slips of paper that we thought that we'd never really know the answers to. And though it felt shocking at the time, it was actually demystifying, helping us to understand that we didn't have to be afraid of sexuality or our own bodies. And it gave us a chance to openly discuss what respectful sexual language looked like, as opposed to more derogatory terms. Those activities were coupled with workshops where we learned that consent is yes, exclamation point, and events like the LGBTQ panel where queer Jewish adults came in to talk to our class, which was also the first time that I'd ever met an out transgender person. I can't tell you what a gift this was to me, a child who had been gender nonconforming their whole life, but lacked any language or adults to help describe or legitimate my experience of the world in the various ways that I was punished for it, subtly and explicitly. While some of these things may seem like basic sex education, they served another extremely important role: breaking taboo to alleviate the shame, confusion, and all of the unsafety that can happen when experiences fester in the dark. And too often, issues of sexuality, especially youth sexuality, go completely unmentioned. Beth Emet is a special place for a lot of reasons, but the Gesher program serves a phenomenally important role in creating a sexually healthy and loving future for us all. By teaching youth that our bodies, our genders, and our sexualities are actually sites of holiness in a way that isn't about forbidding romantic and sexual expression, the Gesher program is probably a major reason I've become the relatively well-adjusted queer adult that I am today. Unlike most sex ed programs, which talk about sex in terms of danger, stigmatizing STDs, and unwanted pregnancy, this curriculum taught me that my desires were good, lovable, and even godly. It taught me that I should not feel ashamed to speak about what I wanted and what I did not want. and that if or when I wanted to have a relationship, or later, as I would discover, lovers and casual sex, I should always feel empowered to make clear my needs and wants, give and ask for consent. It's much easier to do this when you don't feel like sex is some horrible, awful secret that the grown-ups are avoiding telling you about. And the number of grown-ups who still feel that way is staggering, contributing to the deafening silence around all things sex, including harassment and assault. In a heteronormative culture, it is easier to stay silent about sexuality because it's the water that we swim in. There are clearly defined scripts and roles for men and women, boys and girls, and everybody knows them, regardless if they actually find themselves in between. We absorb it from Disney movies and popular book series, our parents, the news, Pew Research studies about the Jewish future and how we all need to be making more Jewish babies. Assumptions can and will be made of all people sorted in this system, which often means that we don't talk about it. However, queer genders and sexuality creates problems in this system. Suddenly, we cannot make the same assumptions. As a transgender person, I can feel the eyes on me every time I walk into a room, trying to figure out if I am a man or a woman, which is to say, strangers are always trying to figure out my genitalia and what my body looks like. I can recall an experience at a birthday party when I was 8, maybe 9. I was the only girl at this all-boys birthday party, and when the time came to wash our hands for cake after laser tag, I recall the attendant facilitator, who was some teenager working a weekend job, grabbing me by the collar as I entered the women's restroom, spitting in my face that I was a little pervert for trying to go inside. It took my friend's frantic protesting and his mom to rush over and clarify that I was actually in the right place, to assure this man that I was, in fact, a girl and that I had not broken the system that he was so furiously protecting. Throughout both my childhood and my adult life, I had not had the privilege of ignoring the way that sex and sexuality informs every social interaction, unlike my cisgender peers. I have many more stories like this from those early years, which, looking back, can reasonably be called sexual harassment. For queer and trans youth who are just beginning to learn how to navigate a world that wishes to interrogate them for something as genuine and innocent as their own desire for self and others, facing that confused hostility day in and day out will wear on their souls. And when that happens in Jewish environments, the spiritual damage can be lifelong. This is completely unacceptable, and we must do better. There's often a fear that talking about sex, gender, and sexuality is not appropriate for kids, but queer youth cannot avoid interactions about their gender and sexuality because they do not comply with the norms expected of them. Appropriateness be damned. While all youth are affected by silence around sexuality, it often lands most squarely on queer and gender nonconforming children. This stigma around sex education manifests in backlash to programs like Gesher, or the same absence of policy around sexuality in most Jewish summer camps and youth groups. But what that often translates into is fear and shame for the children in their care. If, God forbid, situations of abuse do occur, a child who has received a meaningful and empowering sex education like that from Gesher will be more likely to articulate, report, and heal through it than a child that feels that what happened to them was dirty, unspeakable, or worse, their fault. Jewish kids who feel supported and empowered to talk about their genders, bodies, and sexualities grow into Jewish adults who treat themselves and one another with respect, consent, honesty, and love. We better protect our youth and our collective future by talking honestly and clearly about sex and sexuality. Jewish spaces, especially camps, must be environments where all of our children feel safe and comfortable to explore who they are, as Jews whose relationships to spirituality and peoplehood includes their bodies. It is up to us, the adults, to ensure that they have the instructions, confidence, self-love, and resources to do so. That does actually mean talking about sex and sexuality and having very clear, very explicit guidelines around how we interact with our own bodies and the bodies of others, both sexually and not, rather than assuming that don't ask, don't tell will do anything other than embed shame in the kids that we are trying to raise. It means providing funding and resources towards programs and organizations doing this work, and educators who are writing curricula on these topics. It means the explicit inclusion of queer and transgender issues as a standard part of training and education around gender and sexuality, especially in Jewish spaces. It may mean addressing historical trauma around Jewish bodies and how that has impacted our relationships to our bodies and the bodies of other Jews. It absolutely means looking in the face of our own adult fears and discomforts around issues of gender and sexuality, and addressing the ways in which Jewish norms around reproduction, heterosexuality and heteronormativity, and sexual pressure have affected us, so that we can be sure to do better for the generation of Jews that we're now trying to raise. I truly believe that it is possible to do, that we can actually build a Jewish world in which our youth's first encounters with friendships, relationships, gender, and sexuality are informed, positive, loving, and even spiritually meaningful. And a Jewish world that is safer for our queer youth is safer for us all. There's another retelling of the story of the Scouts entering into Eretz Yisrael. It's a perspective that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. When we really think about the Israelites on the doorstep of the Promised Land, even with the Scouts' report that there were a few giants there, it is actually a little bit bizarre that they were so nervous to enter the land. For the last 40 years, they had been miraculously sustained by a super powerful god and had become a feared desert tribe that defeated all who attacked them. It seems like entering the land should be a piece of cake. So why was it that at this last critical moment they became afraid? The answer is not that they were afraid of failure, but rather they were afraid of success. Success in entering the land meant that suddenly they wouldn't be taken care of, like children, how they'd been in the desert. In this next phase of peoplehood, they'd have to farm, to grow up and take responsibility for themselves and their future. Growing up as a people means facing frightening frontiers, including the intimate landscapes of our own bodies. It can be scary to talk about gender and sexuality in these ways, especially in a culture that is often so violent and hostile around these issues. But we can build a safer and more loving Jewish sexual and gendered future. There is a promised land on the other side. Our Jewish youth are counting on us to bring them there. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom, and Happy Pride.
Like I said, brilliant, articulate, and challenging in the best possible way. What an incredible lesson that we learned from Rena Yehuda today. We'll make sure that we let them know how much we appreciated what we heard today and all the work that they continue to do.